بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا دائما وأبدا، نشكره على نعمه التي لا تعد ولا تحصى، ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وأعز المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصاب الحسين عليه الصلاة والسلام. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Sisters and brothers, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يقول الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولا تقولوا لمن يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. Do not call of those who are slain for the sake of Allah as dead. They are alive, but you do not perceive. Last night, during the past 2 nights, I briefly addressed 2 concepts which are critical for understanding or assessing the uprising of Karbala. First night, I focused on the motives and the goals, and the second night on the ground for the uprising. And inshallah, during the coming nights, we will discuss the relationship between the two and ultimately clarify a few points regarding what motivated the uprising of Karbala and how we can learn a lesson from it. Tonight, I want to introduce a theme which on the surface might appear to be a little bit irrelevant. But if we pay attention to it, it focuses on an issue and particularly the conclusion that we can get from the uprising of Ashura and our role within this society. The theme is the coverage of Ashura by our brothers and sisters Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. How do they present Ashura? In the Shia literature, we have huge amount of coverage, various opinions, historical analysis, whether they all, I wouldn't go that as far as saying that every analysis is correct, at least from my humble point of view, but certainly the coverage is extensive. Tonight we want to scratch the surface, when I mean it, because the issue is complex, and contrary to the perception that there is a simplistic view of the Sunni approach to Ashura, there isn't. When we, what we call academically, deconstruct this concept and look at it from in depth. One thing I must start with is that Karbala uprising took place during the most turbulent time of Islamic history. Right during at least after Saqifa, until Amavite established themselves and there was a pattern of leadership and everybody accepted to it, there were huge groups and movements and discourse, counter-analysis, counter-discourse, etc., etc. So the fact that Ashura took place, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Ashura took place during this turbulent time, naturally led to scholars of different groups and different communities to analyze Ashura from their own perspective and from their own political lens. Whether theologically they had a unique understanding of it, religiously they have some unique understanding of it. Whatever their political and theological location, it became the lens by which Ashura was interpreted or history was narrated. And despite all these differences that we have within the literature of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we have to, for the sake of this our discussion, we have to look at it from broad perspective. Remember, during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, up to the 90th of Hijrah, the juristical schools of Shia and Sunnis were not there. The Sunni community had not established juristical schools, whether Abu Hanifa or Malik or Shafi'i or Hanbali. They came late. They certainly, around the end of the first century, we even begin to see the development of Ash'ari and Mu'tazili school of theology. But at least up to 50s and 60s, broadly speaking, we could define the communities that existed into two broad groups. What I call those who followed the Alawi discourse, which naturally accepted the concept of Ghadir and the supremacy of awlawiyya of Ahlul Bayt for the Khilafah and Imamah, and they developed certain narratives to support their argument, which primarily was on Hadith. And the counter, which I call it the Amawite discourse, rejecting the Khilafah or Imamah of Ahlul Bayt, focusing on Saqifa. The Saqifa was correct, and there is a Khilafah, and we have Khilafah is an established order, and we have to follow that order. So we have two discourses. The Amawite discourse on one hand, and the Alawite discourse on the other. I remind you again, the concept of Sunni and Shia had not as a juristical school. Although the theoretical foundation, you can trace it to the early history, but as an established school recognized by themselves, that they call themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, or Shi'at Ali or Ja'fari school, it comes later. Everyone out of this school, they look at the history and they try to create some kind of narrative that says, this is who we are, when the concept of identity became an issue and everybody went after it. But unfortunately, even the two groups, the Amawite as well as the Alawite, are not what I call monolithic, one simple group. You can look at the Alawite group and divide them into what I call khawas or elite. Then Muhibbin, these are people that some have some attachment to Ahlul Bayt. And Awam, yes, there is Ahlul Bayt, but they really did not understand the concept of Imamah, the critical role of Imamah, and majority were the Awam. You see the same thing in Kufa. Khawas, Muhibbin to a degree, and Awam. And as far as the Amawite group, you see the same kind of diversity. The extremists on one side, these are the hardcore Uthmani Amawite tendency that rejected, they were the most antagonistic, took the most antagonistic position about Ahlul Bayt, rejected Imamah completely, and when it came to the concept of Ashura, they related it to the killing of Uthman. Because Uthman was killed, and they claimed that Ali was responsible for it, so they said that this is a revenge for that killing. And they celebrated it. This is the hardcore, what I call extremism. But the moderate, the more tolerant, they had their own narrative. When it came to Ashura, they had their own understanding and their own historical coverage. While the moderate, if you look at the literature, this is why I say it's half an hour, even 45 minutes, will not be enough to scratch the surface. While the moderate have their own literature, and you can detect some of these moderate historians condemn Yazid for the atrocities that he committed. And some of them even go as far as supporting the motives that led Imam Hussein to the uprising. That was standing for justice, the fact that Yazid was corrupt, etc., etc. But they keep the narrative narrow, stay there. They don't want to go back a little bit. But who was responsible for the appointment of Yazid? Muawiyah. Who appointed Muawiyah? Umar. Then we have to go back the whole... No, it stops at Yazid. No more argument. And some of them recently I have seen speakers of Friday prayers and so on that even go in condemning Muawiyah, but no, stop at Muawiyah. These are the moderate. But the extremely hostile, they question the legality of the uprising of Karbala. Not only that, they denounced it as fitna, as something that creates disunity within the Muslim community. And the notion of fabrication of hadith, قتل الحسين بسيف جده. Somehow a hadith from the Holy Prophet that whoever stands up against an established order and creates discord and fitna has to be eliminated. And Yazid was justified in ijtihad, justified in analysis. He considered this uprising as a fitna, and as a leader in charge of the Muslim community that is given the responsibility to protect order, he could do whatever he wants. Remember the verse, أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم. أولي الأمر, according to these people, are only those who are in charge. It doesn't matter whether they have come there as by hooks or by crooks. It's neither here nor there. So this particular group, action of Yazid becomes a legitimate action against a questionable deed of Hussein, irrespective of who Hussein is. There is no justification, because ultimately leads to this discord and disunity. And so Yazid was totally justified. Look at the literature of Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Taymiyyah becomes the feeding or the conduit towards Wahhabis, and Wahhabis go to the crisis that we have. So the extreme, luckily, as time went by, the moderate Sunnis became more in majority to push the extremists out. So Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned and died in prison, and there are others who stood up, immediately rejected by the scholars of the day. So this notion of extreme, even justifying Yazid for killing Hussein, was somehow was put on a back burner. Wahhabism comes in and brings that concept back into the surface. That's a different issue. The moderate coverage of Ashura suffers from huge amount of what we call major faults. Even the moderate. Look at Tabari. Probably the major historians when it comes to reporting Ashura, and there are few things that they do. Number one, omission. They are silent about facts. They focus on simply recording or narrating basic things. When it comes to Ashura, Tabari, the most well-known, probably the greatest Sunni historians, when you look at the coverage of Ashura, it's very sketchy, anecdotal. Only thing that it says, well, Imam Hussein ibn Ali came out of Medina and was confronted by Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas told him not to go to Kufa and not to stand up, because it creates, where we go back again, disunity. And Hussein ibn Ali said, no, I know my own understanding or an analysis, etc., etc. That's it. Nothing about what we call the ground for the uprising and revolt. Nothing for the motives for the revolt. So omission is one of the major issues within Sunni historians. If Tabari is the most well-known historians, most historians that come after him and use his narration and his coverage, they naturally go and do the same thing. Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Abd Rabba, Ibn Asakir, and the list goes on. When you look at their ahadith, Tabari gives minute detail about other issues. But when it comes to Karbala, hardly anything. Very anecdotal and very sketchy. Number two, fabrication. One of the ahadith that they have fabricated, that on the night before Ashura, there was a meeting between Umar ibn Sa'd and Hussein ibn Ali, in which Hussein ibn Ali asked, and this narrated in the history, Hussein ibn Ali asked Umar ibn Sa'd to go to Yazid and facilitate a meeting with Yazid, for him to go to Yazid and resolve this issue as cousins and members of the same family. We would deal with it our own way. Now imagine a Sunni child grows up reading this kind of analysis. What do you want their understanding to be of the ground of revolution and uprising and the motive of revolution? If you have a hadith fabricated that says, yes, Imam Hussein asked Umar ibn Sa'd to be the mediator and facilitate a meeting with Yazid so he can go, he's put his hand in hand of Yazid and resolve this issue. Another painting a very peace-loving picture of Umar ibn Sa'd. That really Umar ibn Sa'd didn't want any of this to take place. No mention of everything else that Umar ibn Sa'd has said and did within Karbala. And finally, exonerating Yazid from killing Imam Hussein and putting the blame on Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Really, Yazid didn't want his cousin to be killed. It was Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad that did it. As we see again, we talked during when finally Ahlul Bayt are taken to Sham and Yazid is exposed by the lectures given and the speeches of Zainab and Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhim salam. Then what does Yazid do? Deflects the attention. La'anallah Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. La'anallah ibn Ziyad. I really didn't want Imam Hussein to be killed. We could have resolved our differences. So these are few of the things. When you look at the history of the moderate school, these are some of the problems. And unfortunately, some of our own historians, somehow these ahadith have penetrated into our own discourse and we repeat them in our books of history for our students. Now, as I said, the two schools of thought, the extremists were eclipsed by the majority, and for a while there was no sign of extremism. Until the Wahhabi movement started, and suddenly the idea of extremism came into the surface. Now you go online, you see the Wahhabi mindset has gone into Pakistan, India, even Eastern Iran, Syria, and other places, and Far East. And although they are nothing to do with the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, but at least the mindset is there, and constant attack against Shias and Shia majalis on Abi Abdullah al-Hussein or anything else. This is something that we need to address. Now fast forward. That was what I call the classical approach. During the 1920s and 1930s, which most of us We're not there, but the history is recorded. When the liberation theology and liberation movement started to develop in India and Pakistan, to liberate themselves from the colonial powers, British, Dutch, German, French, or anybody else in Africa, whether they were Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, or whatever, they went back to their own historical sources, trying to reread history and find out some narratives that would support these liberation movement for freedom. Because at the end of the day, the ground people had faith, and they needed a green light from the faith to stand up before the British and fight. You go and look at Nehru's or Gandhi's point of view, or Muslims, Allama Iqbal, or others that existed in 1920s and 1930s. Occasionally they refer to certain text. So it became necessary both for the Shia community and the Sunni community to come out of that traditional classic approach to assessment of Ashura, because the independent movement and the liberation movement wanted narrative, historical narrative, examples, modalities that they can imitate and follow. Subhanallah. Karbala became number one issue, both within the Sunni community as well as within the Shia community. If they wanted to go back and say we have something in history that supports such movement and becomes the role model for the liberation movement and stands up, these are the concepts that Shahada, we see during this period, Shahada, Jihad, justice, resisting tyranny, revolt, rebellion, revolution became topical issues. And what revolution encapsulates everything? Karbala. They had to go back to Karbala and start analyzing Karbala again. These people became extremely flexible, to a degree removed themselves from the historical classical narrative and began to reflect to the history of Karbala and the uprising Karbala from a different perspective. That rather than focus on the tragic part or the tragedy, rather than focus on say the killing and everything else, they focus on the universal messages that exist with the event of Karbala, and use those messages as a sign of liberation, supporting liberation and spreading it around. People such as Abdul Rahman Sharqawi, an Egyptian scholar, Al-Hussein Tha'iran wal-Hussein Shahidan. He writes a play and clearly states that Hussein originally, when he stood up, he didn't stand up to be violent or anything else. He stood up لطلب الإصلاح في أمة جدي رسول الله, focused on the concept of Islah and reform in society. Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad, Abu Shuhada Hussein ibn Ali. If you read his book, he makes the effort. Well, he doesn't come as close to the Shia understanding of thing, but at least the fact that he detaches himself from the classical understanding of Sunnism and hatred and so on, and says there is a ground when you understand this character, who Hussein was. By the way, the moderate group, in their analysis of history, they pay too much attention to the character of Hussein. Huge amount of literature about how Holy Prophet dealt with Hussein, treated Hussein, kissed Hussein, respected Hussein. It's all said that. So Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad says, if this is the character, and then look at the character of Yazid, you have no other choice but to reach the conclusion that Hussein embodies all the values of Islam and opposes him, Yazid, that has devoid of all values. And if this is the understanding, there is no other option for somebody who embodies Islam to stand up against somebody who doesn't, not Muslim. Dr. Taha Hussein is another Egyptian scholar. Muhammad Kamil al-Banna, Khalid Muhammad Khalid, Said Ali Jalal al-Husseini al-Masri, has a book called Al-Imam Hussein ibn Ali. And in other places, Allama Muhammad Iqbal and few other scholars, that despite the fact that they were not in the classical term Shias, but they looked at what we call the liberative values and concepts and themes within the uprising of Ashura and focused on it. At the time where the Muslim community needed literature to support them from liberation from, say, the British colonialism, or in Africa to liberate themselves from French colonialism, or somewhere else, these kind of values came to the rescue. And Allama Iqbal has even a set of poems regarding Karbala and the value of Karbala, Hussein, etc., etc. Both in the mystical sense, because around the end of his time, he became more inclined to be mysticism and irfan, but as well as a political concept, role model for the society to follow. Now, unfortunately, very rarely, from 2010 onwards, with the advent of Wahhabism getting loose and huge amount of money being supported, given to them by the current regime in Arabian Peninsula, this kind of moderate language to become prominent is no longer there. What is prominent, unfortunately, is the extremism. What is our responsibility? We live in a cosmopolitan society. The Sunni masjid is in about what, 5-10 minutes from you? Why they are not here? That's a question, a critical question we have to ask ourselves. We really need to liberate. Marhum Matari, my professor, said once something, that we Shias kept the memory of Hussein alive within ourselves. But the memory of Hussein did not exceed our limits and the parameters of our own existence. It remained preaching for the convert. But in a complex reality that we have, those, call it universal values that exist within the uprising of Hussein, those are the one that has to go outside. And if you are able to clearly define them, develop a language, a narrative for them, not only the Sunni community, as it happened during the 1920s and 1930s, came to Imam Hussein as a role model for the liberation movement. Even today, they will come to Imam Hussein. But we are paralyzed within that unique classical approach to a commemoration of Imam Hussein. When we have, if we have, we organized, there were a number of conferences organized in Iran, not on the what we call classical Shia approach to the commemoration of Ashura, no. Focusing on grand values, universal values within the uprising. I have 17 volumes of only articles and essays that were submitted to this conference, and each one about 350 to 400 pages, attracting scholars from Maghreb, Morocco, to Far East, from Iran to go to Russia and go to South Africa. There is huge scope within the uprising of Imam Hussein that we really, as people who are living in this cosmic society that mixes everything together, the opportunity is open. So Haj Shabani, the rest of the group, Dr. Hussein, others, Next time that you try to organize Ashura, plan for inviting Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in. And develop a unique methodology and language that we focus. They don't have to come every night. Still leave some space for Aza and everything else in the unique manner that we have accustomed to. But at least few nights that we can work together in developing a unique narrative and themes that both have something in common with them. African American community, they have suffered under this regime and system for years. They have huge amount of benefit to get from that liberation of Imam Hussein and Karbala uprising. The Native Americans and others. We have potential to universalize the message if the right narrative and the right themes are identified. 1920s and 1930s were not just years in which Ahl Sunnah discovered and they went to the history and reread history, engaged history again. Even the Shia community did the same thing. If it wasn't for people like Mutahari, Talaqani, Beheshti, Shariati, and everybody else, which they created the basis for the Islamic revolution, I don't think it would have happened. Marhum Imam wasn't far off when he said this revolution succeeded because of the true understanding of Hussein and Ashura. I think there is a huge amount of work and scope that we can work with others. It's only a matter of getting things together and developing it. Hussein doesn't belong to the Shia. Hussein is a universal figure, belongs to humanity collectively. Ashura has so many messages, so many themes, so many ideas in it that we can develop for every community. You can focus on it. The Christians can understand from it. The Jews can understand from it. The Buddhists and Hindus can understand from it. The atheists can understand from it. The agnostic can understand from it. Humans as humans, Ashura has something to teach them. May Allah bless all of us, inshallah, and guide us to the right path. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the privilege of being among the true followers of Ahlul Bayt. And inshallah we'll continue with our own, go back to the theme of our conversation. But please think about this possibility. You can become the maverick, the forefront runners. No others, hardly any other center is prepared to do it. And during my time at the Islamic Center, they were not receptive to these kind of ideas. So let's think about it. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.